evening to everybody else. Thank you for joining us on this 11th Author Success webinar, but the first one for me. The title of this one is Planning for Success, Best Practices for Preparing Your Paper or Thesis, in which I'm going to present some advice and tips for making the writing process more efficient and less stressful. So before we start, I'd just like to say that I'm happy to be interrupted if you have any specific questions along the way. So just write your questions in the Q&A box and somebody will be monitoring that. So I don't mind being interrupted to have a chat while we go along. We'll also have 10 or 15 minutes for questions and discussion at the end of the webinar. Okay, so there are many components to a research study. Whether it's your PhD or a research study that you're doing postdoc or later on in your career. But the ultimate outcome is usually the publication of at least one article in a scientific journal. So to warm up, let's start out by thinking about what part of the research process you enjoy most. I'm sure we all have different preferences to an extent, so let's do a quick poll to see what you think. So Felix, if you could, or do I bring up the poll? Just one moment while I find the poll. Yeah.
This will be under Nick, I believe.
Okay.
Nick has the access for polls. Okay. Yes, there it is.
Okay, so we have a poll here. Answer number 1 is planning the study and developing the methodology, carrying out the research in the lab or field, analyzing your data and discovering what your study has found, or writing up your research for publication or examination. Okay. Just watching the results come in. It seems like analyzing your data and discovering what your study has found is by far the most popular part of the process. Yes, followed by, well, actually fairly equal for planning the study, carrying out the research and writing up your research for publication. So that's quite interesting. The favorite part for me was always carrying out the research in the lab or field. It was for me, that was by far the most interesting bit. Although, of course, analyzing the data afterwards.
I'm surprised that writing up the research is that high. I thought there would be a. Yeah.
To me, it was the most dreaded part, and for a lot of people, I know. But that's good to see. Okay, so thank you very much for that. I just need to close the poll. Okay, so that's interesting. Let's move on. So for those of you that didn't choose writing up your paper as your favorite part of the research process, this might be a familiar story to you. This was certainly me as I was doing my PhD. I absolutely dreaded the days that I set aside for writing, so I would just do anything else that I possibly could to avoid having to sit down at my desk and actually start typing my actual thesis. I didn't mind doing any other part of it, but this was really, really hard for me. It just felt like the task was too enormous and I didn't know where to start. I didn't really know how to go about it, and the outcome just seemed too uncertain. So eventually, of course, I did get my PhD written under pressure from my supervisor, but it didn't stop there. My problems didn't really stop there, because as a postdoc, I kind of got even worse because I was now swamped with all kinds of other things that took up my time, things like teaching and preparing new research studies and so on. So trying to get my actual PhD written up into papers for publication was really, really tough. Fortunately, I got a new mentor at some point who was really, really good and gave me much more guidance on how to get me through the writing process, and gave me lots of tips about the best way to approach it and so on. So I just kind of wished that I'd had lots more advice earlier on in my research career so that I could have been more efficient and less frightened of writing papers. And I think this probably is a familiar story for many of you. And that's why I wanted to provide you with these hopefully helpful tips and suggestions. So during this webinar, we're going to cover, first of all, just quickly look at why writing is so hard for so many of us. Then we'll look at deciding the direction of your paper, your target audience and your target journal, organizing your resources, making and sticking to a schedule, collaborating effectively, and creating a state of flow and avoiding writer's block. So let's first just think about why writing is so hard. As I think it's easier to forgive yourself for not enjoying the process of writing if you realize that the problem isn't only yours, that a lot of people suffer from the same anxiety about writing. So as this cartoon illustrates, getting your thoughts out of your head and onto the page should be easy enough. It's, after all, it just involves a simple sequence of events and commands that go from your brain to your fingers to get the words onto the computer. That really doesn't sound too difficult. And yet this is how it actually usually works. And we end up with all this kind of hesitation, confusion, fear, panic, all these kind of different emotions that arise when we're sitting down to actually write our paper. So where does it come from, this anxiety? I think there's several factors that contribute to it. I think one of the first ones is that we're just not formally taught the skills of academic writing beyond writing lab reports and essays and so on. So I got plenty of help with that, but just not with formulating an actual paper for publication. It seems to be just assumed that people will know how to do it, and yet almost everyone I've spoken to has agreed that they would have benefited from some kind of training. So there's often a fear among researchers that they're just not a good writer. They just feel like it's just them that isn't good at this process. So they avoid writing in the hope that they won't be found out. There are also lots of competing demands on researchers' time. So these tend to take priority because if you're working in a department, you're most likely to be chased about, or to be concerned about your teaching priorities, your admin duties and all the rest of it, whereas your papers are yours alone and nobody is necessarily going to chase you about those on a daily basis. I think there's a huge fear of judgment when you're writing at the frontiers of knowledge. And what I mean by that is that your research is producing something that presumably has never been produced before. Nobody has been here. You're offering something new to the world, and that can be really daunting, I think. When you get it out there, will it be judged to be acceptable? Will it be up to standard, or will it be rejected and you'll feel like a failure? Really not a nice feeling to start with. And then finally, you're all, I'm sure, aware of the phrase "publish or perish." And I know that researchers today are under more pressure than ever before to produce papers, and not just to publish them, but to publish them in high impact journals. So I think this creates a huge pressure on researchers today. So what can we do about this? We can't just give up because it's all too difficult. We need to actually have some strategies to help us through the process. The first thing I suggest is to make a plan. I'm not, I have to admit, a great planner in real life, but I do strongly suggest planning for projects of this size. I'm not one of these people that writes endless lists, but for any kind of big project, I really would recommend starting with a plan right from the beginning. So the first question you might ask is, when you're drawing up your plan, is where should you begin? And I think the process should actually begin even before you start your study. So the process starts when you start reviewing the literature to identify a gap in knowledge, or you start writing your research proposal to fund your study or your PhD. So at this point, you're already collecting the material that will form the basis of your, for instance, your introduction of your paper eventually. Although, of course, you will be continually revising and updating it as the process goes on, right up until you're ready for to submit it for publication. So if you see it like as an ongoing process like this, it avoids that kind of question of when am I going to start writing? You're never faced with that blank page and now I have to sit down and actually write this, because you've collected your notes, you've been doing all this kind of generating and sharing ideas, you've got lots of feedback, you've got all kinds of materials ready. So once you're actually there, about to put it onto into a final paper, the process has been ongoing for months or possibly years beforehand. So one of the first things that you need to decide as you're making a plan is what story do you want your paper to tell? So when I say story, I obviously don't mean that your paper should be fiction. That's not something that anyone would encourage. However, a good story does set up and then resolve an interesting question or problem in the reader's mind. So in a story, you expose your characters to a well-defined plot. So something happens to them and then there's an outcome. And you take the reader through this process with you. In a scientific paper, the characters might be the participants or the chemicals or the tissue samples or whatever it is that you are studying. And the plot is your methods that you apply to the characters and the results you obtain from them. The results provide you with the answer to your question or problem, and that's revealed to the reader in the discussion and conclusion. So as I say, it's not a story per se, but it does give you a narrative to work on. So to tell a coherent story, you need to be clear from the beginning about what your paper will focus on. A research project can produce an abundance of data, but you need to decide what specifically you want to include. As this cartoon illustrates, you can choose a narrow focus. That means you might be able to produce more than one paper from your data, but these papers might be rather thin and rather less interesting to a broader audience. So you can also try packing more into one paper to make it more interesting, but then you risk losing the audience. You risk losing your readers as they get confused by multiple experiments and dozens of hypotheses, and the paper just going on and on. And so at that point, there's always, I think it's worth questioning whether you want to break it down into more than one paper. So it's trying to find that balance to decide where your focus will lie. To help with this, I suggest that you prepare what I call a vision statement. So this is basically your take-home message that you can write up in no more than 2 or so sentences. I think most of us get used to doing this as PhD students because people are constantly asking you what your PhD is about. So I think you get used to like trying to come up with a succinct way of getting across what you're actually doing in your PhD. So I recommend doing this with all studies, just having this kind of neat phrase, your take-home message that you want to convey to the readers at the end. I think keeping this this end message in mind throughout the writing process can help you to filter your decisions about what goes in and what you leave out of your paper. So so long as you're clearly focused at the end where you finish with your message, it will help to decide whether this part is worth including. Does it actually help you to get there? Does it help the narrative towards that endpoint? If not, then it can be left out. Otherwise, you might realize that there's some kind of gap that you need to fill in some gap in your story because you haven't got a clear narrative as to how you get to this endpoint. So once you've decided on the focus of your paper, you need to decide on your target audience. It's obviously very related. Deciding your target audience right from the start is really helpful, as many decisions will be affected by who you expect to read the paper. This diagram here shows the target audience for an ecology paper published in Crustacean Research. It's easy to extrapolate the audience for different fields. Here, the target audience or focal audience is ecologists. So this obviously is an ecology paper, and that's the target audience. So if it was a social science paper, your target audience would be social science researchers, or more specifically psychology researchers, or more specifically clinical psychology researchers, and so on and so on. But you also have a secondary audience, and this might consist of people with a peripheral or a very important interest in your paper, but not directly other researchers. So this might include, in this instance, journalists, land management planners, conservationists, science students, and so on and so on. And then finally, you have your peripheral audience, people who might be policymakers, politicians, the public, educators, and so on. So you need to decide who or which of these kind of groups you want to focus on most. And obviously that will depend on the focus of your paper. So you can try and attract all of these different audiences at once in one paper, but you might find that it's rather difficult to do that because you're writing for so many different needs. So to be realistic, realistically, your research needs to be very innovative and compelling to attract this broadened audience. If you need to write for clinicians and practitioners and policymakers and so on, you might benefit from producing a different kind of paper, a different kind of publication, in addition to your research paper. So the content and style of your paper should obviously match your audience. You need to consider, for instance, how much your audience already knows about the subject. This is really important because you need to consider how much you use jargon and technical terms. If you're just focusing your paper on fellow researchers, then of course they'll all be familiar with your jargon and technical terms, and you don't need to worry too much about defining them in great detail. However, if you're looking for a broader audience, you'll really need to add a lot more explanation and detail, and perhaps avoid some of the jargon you might normally use to avoid losing those kind of readers. And as I say, it might be worth considering different publication types to avoid this kind of conflict between the different audiences and their needs. So once you have an idea about the contents of your paper and your audience, then you need to think about which journal you should aim to publish in. Of course, this is strongly related to your target audience. It's all on journal selection. So here I'm just going to touch on why I think it's important to think about your target journal early in the research process. I think having a target journal in mind helps to focus the content of your paper. So as you write, you'll have in mind the journal's mission statement, its scope and agenda. So you'll be writing with that in mind, making your paper particularly relevant to that specific journal. Journals also have different formats for publishing work, not just research papers, but also things like letters, short communications, review papers, research elements such as methods and protocols and so on. So you might want to consider publishing or submitting for publication one of these different types of article, as well as your main research paper. So knowing your target journal from the start will also help you to write your paper according to the journal guidelines, including using a template if the journal provides one, and making sure that you keep to the word count, making sure that you don't need to reformat the paper at the last minute to actually submit it for publication. Okay, so we've got everything else in place. We've decided on our target audience, journal, and our focus of the paper. Now we need to start organizing. And as this quote from Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, once said, "Before anything else, preparation is the key to success." So let's look at the things you can do to prepare for writing your paper. The first thing I would advise is to develop a schedule. So it's almost like taking a project management approach. Whether it's for your PhD or for a journal publication, planning your time and creating deadlines will help keep you on track. If you approach it like a project management, more like a project management task than a writing task, it can be useful because there are so many different aspects of your research to consider. If you just look at the writing process itself, of course, that's reasonably narrow. But if you're starting from the beginning of the process, you want to be able to plan from your end point, which is the publication, back towards the beginning of the process and make a plan for the whole project. So with this in mind, you might want to consider using project management software. It can be really useful to help to plan out your dates, your deadlines, how all the different parts of the process fit together. There's lots of different kinds of software that you can use, some of it quite simple, some of it quite complex. I've given a few examples here. Some of these are free, you can use them or available to a low cost, so they shouldn't be too onerous even for a PhD student. Some of them are only really worth using for more complex projects, so especially collaborative projects where you've got several people working on the same thing, where you need to be able to share lots of information and deadlines and things. But as I say, even if you're just working by yourself, using a simple kind of scheduler can be really helpful in keeping you on track. So the kind of things that you might need to include in your plan is starting where we just were, outlining the purpose and message of your paper, identifying your target audience and selecting your journal. All of the non-writing tasks that need to be completed, such as your literature search, data analysis, producing figures and tables, and so on and so on. Drafting each section of the manuscript, getting feedback on it, revising, and finalizing your draft. I emphasize that because I do believe that this is a really important stage of writing your paper. Writing your cover letter, sending your draft to AsiaEdit for editing, and submitting the manuscript to the target journal. So you've got this plan and you've got all of these different tasks in it. Now you need to make yourself accountable to make sure that you keep you need to keep yourself on track with it. It's pointless having a plan that you then file away and never read it again. So keep it somewhere that it's always visible and available. So you need to set deadlines for each of your tasks and put them in a calendar so that you get reminders about them. If you're doing a PhD, your supervisor should have a copy of your plan and the deadlines that you've set yourself. If you're working collaboratively with a team, make sure that you work with each other to stay on track. If you're a sole researcher or author, ask a colleague to help. It can be really helpful. It can be a two-way process. So if your colleague is also writing a paper, you can help each other. Just meeting up with each other over a coffee or something, asking how you're doing, looking at each other's drafts and so on, and just generally finding support for yourself as you go through the process. If you don't have any of these available, or if you're very new to academia, then it can be really useful to join or create a writing group. So somewhere where you can meet with other people that are going through the same process as you. That might be fellow students, for instance, or just anybody who's writing anything, just to somebody to bounce ideas off and to perhaps have the occasional sob when you're getting stuck and don't know where you're going. So I recommend this one site called Shut Up Write is designed to do this. It's designed for creative writers, researchers, anybody that wants to create a writing group of their own. We just mentioned collaboration, so just while we're talking about it, I'll just give you some additional tips for effective collaboration. So most research studies beyond PhDs, or even within PhDs, I have to say, are conducted collaboratively. However, as we all know, working with others can present particular problems that can make the process really quite inefficient, or even cause it to fail altogether. So it's really important that you keep the process on track. The best way to avoid this is to plan how your team or your collaborator will work together. Obviously, this applies to the whole research project, but here we just focus on the writing stage. I think the first thing is to decide on roles and responsibilities from the outset. This is roles and responsibilities for who's going to do what and who is going to be responsible for it, so that nobody can duck out and say, it wasn't my job to do that. Everybody knows what they have to do. I think determining authorship early on is really important too. There can be obviously a lot of bad feeling amongst researchers at times when people don't feel like they've put more into the research process or the writing process than is recognized by the order of authors on the final paper. So make sure that you understand right from the beginning. This is important for PhD students too. Some of my PhD was published, although I'd done the research and been very heavily involved with the writing. One of my collaborators eventually published one of my papers as first author, with my agreement, of course, and it actually was really helpful to me. But it was really good to know from the start that that was going to be the case, so that there was no hard feelings about it. You need to agree, obviously, on the contents and direction of the paper. So all the processes that we've talked about so far need to be done in collaboration with your team. And then you need to follow the schedule, as we just talked about. And finally, I would say communicating regularly is really important. I've had several projects go stale because we just haven't kept in contact enough. So you kind of assume that somebody else is doing something, but you haven't got time to do anything yourself. And so in the end, like not having any communication, you start to think, oh, well, I haven't got time for that. I'll leave it, I'll put it aside. And that can really hold up the writing of a paper. So agree on a communication and meeting schedule and stick to it, even when you feel you have no progress to report. So perhaps other team members might be able to help you refocus if you're getting stuck. So I say don't use the lack of progress as an excuse not to meet. Prepare an agenda for your meetings, take notes during them and share the notes afterwards to avoid later disagreements or just avoid forgetting. So having a track record of everything that you do can be really, really helpful. Okay, so now the next thing is to think about how to organize your resources. You'll need to develop good organizational skills to keep track of everything you need to write your paper. So what do we do? Of course, we need to develop a system. We need to plan how to organize your literature, your data, your research notes, observations, field and lab notes, and multimedia content. So this is all generated as part of your research, and it is very tempting to just leave it in a mess in your computer somewhere without ever developing a system of organization, which I would really advise against. So the first thing I think is to use search databases effectively. When you're starting out, when you're very first thinking about your project, doing a literature review, you all use databases to search for the literature, but make sure that you use them effectively and make sure that when you've done a search, you keep what you've found organized. Don't just do huge literature searches and put everything into a citation manager software and leave it there as one big bulk. You need to be able to organize your literature so that you can put your hands on what you need when you want it. You're probably all familiar with citation management software. I think EndNote is probably the most widely used in academia, but it is expensive. So if you don't have a subscription to it, there are lots of alternatives. I use Zotero and Mendeley. I think these are two really good referencing packages. They store not only references, but you can also attach things like PDFs and audio and video files on websites and things. So you can keep all of your materials organized in one place in these kind of programs. Another reason you need to be organized is because being disorganized can inadvertently lead to plagiarism. If you're disorganized in the way that you file your literature and the notes that you take while reviewing the literature, it's very likely that you're going to end up with quotes just sitting around in your computer, in different files, in different places, or just in a notepad maybe. And when you're actually writing up, you come across one and you go, oh, that's really good. I like that. I'll put that in my paper. But you haven't got with it the attribution, the source that you used for that quote. It might look like something that you've written yourself, so you don't think you need to attribute it to anything. Maybe you do recognize it as something that you've taken from a source, but as I say, without a reference, you're just going to have to go back and search the literature all over again to find it. So always, if you write something down or copy something, put it in quotation marks immediately so that you know that it's a quotation. I think that's a really helpful thing to do. Anything that's not in quotation marks can be your own writing. I would also advise trying to paraphrase these kind of quotes as soon as you kind of copy and paste them or whatever, as soon as you save them. I think this is really helpful because it helps you, for one thing, to get the idea straight in your mind. If you can paraphrase it yourself, it really helps to understand it. And it also helps because you've then got the paraphrase as well as the quotes available when you actually come to writing up. And this will really help you not to inadvertently put in information that you've taken from somewhere else and forgotten to add the source for. Data storage is probably one of the most important aspects to think about. your institution, funder or target journal will undoubtedly have requirements for the accessibility and use of data. Obviously, it's for ethical reasons. Data needs to be kept secure. Certain things need to happen to it, and you can't ignore this. You can't just collect data and put it on your computer and do nothing else about it. Failure to not organize your data and not to have any idea how you're going to organize it will have serious consequences, because it will make your analysis and writing less efficient further down the line. You'll spend so much time having to search for what you need in your data, and you could also fail to include important aspects of your data in your paper. So that can really easily happen. For instance, if you've done an analysis, but you've filed it away somewhere, and when you're actually writing your paper, you've forgotten that you've done it, and it doesn't get included. You need to be rigorous in keeping track of what you do with your data. So keep all of the versions that you work on, label them clearly so that you know which one's the original, which one has imputed missing data, which one has log transformed values, and so on and so on. PLOS, the Public Library of Science, one of the leading open access journals, has produced this checklist for data management. It suggests that you, at the planning stage, you consider what types of data will be created, how will these data be processed, how will they be stored and backed up, how will they be documented, including naming conventions, directory structures, etc. How will these data be of benefit to the broader scientific community? How will they be archived, and will they comply with any data or metadata standards? How will they be made available and discoverable to the broader community? And what are the policies for data sharing and reuse, etc.? I've put the web address for this checklist here. I'm sure that you will find it useful in trying to make those decisions about your data. Now I've got all those other resources, our lab notes, research notes, observations, and so on and so on. We need to decide where and how to store everything. Most people will use their hard drive because it's the most convenient and you can work at your computer wherever you are. However, I'm sure we've all heard tales of people having some disaster with their computer where their hard drive has just died and their data and their whole thesis is irretrievable, and yeah, complete disaster. So to avoid that, I would recommend using cloud storage. The advantage is that you can access the files from anywhere, and there's less risk of data loss and corruption. Obviously, a comprehensive approach is to do both. So you can use your hard drive initially, but then back it up on the cloud every day. Like, I really would emphasize every day. If you're working on it every day, then you need to have a double method of storage every day.
I guess something like OneDrive or Dropbox would automate that, but you can automate your backup.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. Yes, there's lots of different ways of doing it, and I guess, yeah, those two are probably the most common. So once you've got your you've decided where you're going to put everything, you need to work out how to organize the materials within your system. So don't just create a folder and dump everything in without creating a file structure. It always just feels like at the beginning, like it's not going to get out of hand. You know how this is going to work. You know where you've put things. You know that this version is the one that says this, and that one's the one that you sent to so and so. But will you know that 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months down the line? So develop and stick to a filing, naming, and coding system. I was just using dates in your file names to keep track of different versions. Put tags on the file names so that you know how not just the date of it, but what it actually is, what the difference between something this version and that version is. And then I would strongly suggest keeping a record of your system. So if you leave things for a while, you might find that you've forgotten how your filing and labeling system works, which of course is not funny. It's something that you might have developed yourself, but it doesn't mean to say it's going to make sense to you in 6 months' time. Having said all that, I'm a strong believer in just having notes and post-its and you just handwriting on your desk, just having things right in front of you for things to do on a daily basis. So sometimes it's just easier to jot it down and have a list of tasks for the day that you need to complete rather than opening your software or whatever. But do use both in combination. I say it's useful to have different kinds of methods. Okay, so we've got all the data organized, a plan for the paper, target journal decided, and so on. Now let's look at the writing process itself. So most of us would imagine starting writing in a word processor such as Word, but I would like you to consider using alternatives as well for various reasons. One tool that I particularly like is called Scrivener, which is like a word processor. You can do all of the things that you do in a word processor in it, but it also allows you to add lots of different files. You can write things in different sections. So for instance, you might want to write even in separate paragraphs, separate sections of your paper and so on. And then you can kind of tile them within the program so that you can rearrange them into different places. And this really helps when you're trying to work out the sequence of information, for instance, in your introduction. You've got a nice, easy way to combine and uncombine. And then at the end of the day, it will output everything into a Word file so that you've just got the final result. But I think it's really useful because being able to attach resources to each particular page means that you've got the references that you used for that particular piece of writing there together with the writing. I mean, not just the citation, but the actual paper. You can open like a PDF alongside your Word document, your word processing document. So you've got the two running side by side. It's really, really helpful, I find, for keeping track of your writing and to organize it. You need to schedule a time and place. I think it's very easy, particularly for postdocs, researchers, having your time taken over by other things. It tends to be that we look at writing as something that happens at the end of all of our other jobs, because, as I say, we've often got other people clamoring for us to finish other kind of duties. So this is not quite the same as your overall long-term plan for the study, but this is a kind of more of a daily or weekly schedule for the actual writing. So I think you need to make sure nothing else takes over. So when you've put it in a diary, it means that is your time. Nothing else is going to encroach on that. You need to plan where you'll work from so that you don't find you've got your afternoon free to write, but then you realize that you don't have a desk to work from, or your kids are at home and it's not possible to work from your home office, and so on and so on. So make sure that you know where you'll work from. Find other opportunities to write apart from just sitting down at a desk. So for instance, if you find yourself with spare time during the day, you might want to perhaps use a voice recorder or just take notes or just to have ideas. Just think about your writing. It doesn't have to be actually putting words on the page to be contributing to your final outcome. Also identify your most productive time of day. I think it's most of us kind of identify as like maybe a morning lark or an evening owl. So we find that we must work most productively at a particular time of day. And it can be helpful to assign your writing periods to these times. But also don't be too precious about it, because obviously when you've got a lot to do, you need to just work whenever you can, whenever you find the time. So when you're planning your writing time, how long should you plan to write for? I would distinguish between binge writing and snack writing. So binge writing is where you set out to write for the whole day, or for several hours at least. And snack writing is where you write in very short bursts. For some people, they might feel horrified if they look at the whole day and it's just writing. It's just not going to work for them. Whereas doing 2 hours each day over the course of a week can be more palatable. So when you're blocking out your time, you need to also think about how to break it up, because if you're going to do a whole day's work, you cannot possibly sit down and just write for 6 hours or whatever. And even if it's just a 2-hour session, it's too long to focus. And a lot of psychological research tells us that we must not do this. We must focus for short periods and then take a break. So there's what's called the Pomodoro technique, comes from the name of the tomato timer that the first person who used this technique used to time their working and breaks. So the best way is to work for 25 minutes at a time, take a 5-minute break, and then work for another 25 minutes and another 5-minute break. And after 2 hours, take a 15 to 30-minute break at least. And this will ensure that you don't get exhausted throughout your writing session. It keeps you fresh. Now you need to use your writing time wisely, and you've got to avoid getting caught in the trap of doing everything else on your list. So even if you've kept everybody else away and all these other distractions are gone, you can still distract yourself by doing anything apart from actual writing. So make sure that you don't do that. Another problem is starting the day by reviewing yesterday's writing, and then you get stuck into editing that. You get more absorbed in what you did yesterday than what you're supposed to be doing today. And as I'll come to later shortly, editing is a separate process. It's not something that we want to be doing alongside the actual writing because it stops your creativity. Try not to spend all day looking for that perfect reference or quote, because again, it's just a procrastination. Same with internet rabbit holes. You just start searching for some useful information that you need and find that you're still there 2 hours later and really it wasn't that important. And also don't wait for inspiration. So if you're just not feeling like things are going to flow that day, then there are things that you can do about it, as we'll come to in a minute. So what we want really is to create what's called a state of flow. This idea was introduced by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, the founder of the positive psychology movement in the 1970s. And I think that the idea of a state of flow has become really common in lots of different fields, particularly fields that involve lots of skill and creativity, such as sports and the arts. So he described it as such: my mind isn't wandering. I'm not thinking of something else. I'm totally involved in what I'm doing. My body feels good. I don't seem to hear anything. The world seems to be cut off from me. I'm less aware of myself and my problems. So if this feels familiar to you, so maybe it happens when you're writing, maybe it happens when you're playing a sport, maybe doing some art, or even just reading a book. You can just get really so absorbed that you're totally in the current moment and unaware of anything that's happening outside. So this is an ideal state to write in. However, it's not necessarily going to just happen because you've set yourself up for a writing session. The things you can do to help a state of flow emerge are first of all, turn off all distractions. So things like social media, messaging services, and so on and so on. At the very least, you need to turn off your social media. I think is the worst interrupter, because we're all very vulnerable to receiving a message and just again turning our attention away for far too long. If you plan to write in the morning, I would say try to start before you've even looked at any of these distractions. So before you even start turning on any of these other other things on your phone or on your computer, start your writing so you've got a clear head before you begin. You can also use apps that are available to block or limit access to certain websites at times you choose. So you can decide that your computer will not allow you to open a website, or only for a limited time or whatever within your working day. You need to keep your office door closed and tell your colleagues, friends, family, or whoever might be around that you do not want to be disturbed. Get yourself comfortable and relaxed so that you're not distracted by sitting in an uncomfortable chair or wanting a cup of coffee the minute you sit down or whatever. And one of the best ways, I think, to prepare yourself for a writing session is to start with a short ritual. So you might start by listening to some soothing ambient music, for instance, or doing yoga or practicing meditation, which will help clear your mind of distractions before you begin. I'm a great believer in the yoga and meditation route before I do anything important. Next, set a goal for each writing session. So this should be a clear and realistic short-term goal so that you're not distracted by thinking about what it is that you need to achieve in this writing session. The goal needs to be achievable, but not too simplistic. So you want to start with something that will challenge you, but not overwhelm you. You might want to start with something manageable to warm up, and then plan to do the harder parts a bit later on in the session once you come into a flow. So just set out the tasks that you might want to do in what order. An optimum state of flow it starts with effortful kind of work at the beginning here as you get into the task, and then it becomes effortless as you enter the state of flow. This tends to be happening in the first sort of, not right at the beginning, but in the first sort of half an hour to an hour. You should emerge into a good state of flow, and then as you tire, it will become more effortful until you're exhausted. I wouldn't recommend working until the point of exhaustion. If you use this in combination with the Pomodoro technique, I think you can really see how your writing should kind of go in these peaks and troughs, and then you'll get to know yourself when you should be taking your breaks. Of course, sometimes this state of flow just doesn't arise, and the opposite of it becomes writer's block. So sometimes, no matter how hard we try, the words just aren't appearing on the page. And when they do, we're just nothing but critical about them. So we just need a few tips about how to get over this hump. I would suggest warming up with some free writing. So it's just a kind of different tactic. Rather than writing the section of your paper that you're meant to be writing, give yourself permission to write about anything at all for 5 minutes. So maybe that means getting all of the things swimming around your head onto the page. So all of the day-to-day stuff, you might just write it down so that you can put it out the way and forget. Or you might give yourself a prompt to write about something for 5 minutes. So you could, for instance, write, the point I'm trying to make here is, or I think this result means that, and then just carry on writing from there. So it's not meant to be a finished product. It's not meant to be something that will appear in your paper. It's just meant to get the ideas immediately onto the page so that you can see something. You've got something to start with and something to work with. You can then, if you get stuck, just delete it and go back to the prompt and start again. Just keep doing this until you feel like you're actually typing fluently. I'm sure it can take several goes, but give yourself at least 5 minutes to do this if you're feeling like you're struggling to get into the task. And at the end of the day, even if you don't use any of what you've written, at least you've got something, some ideas on the page. Next, try not to be a perfectionist, although academics are renowned for their being perfectionists, and quite rightly, because getting things right is fundamental to high quality research. Perfectionism can severely hinder your progress when you're writing, because it can lead to procrastination if you set yourself unobtainable goals, as this figure illustrates. So it must be my best work ever, but it sets off the pressure. It's all too overwhelming, and you just go round and round in a procrastination loop where you avoid getting started because the task that you face is too difficult. You set yourself too high a target. So you need to turn off your inner critic and just let your mind produce what it will, no matter whether you'll be happy to show it to a colleague or supervisor at the end of the day. Just write it and don't criticize yourself. Don't even think about the final product at this stage. All the honing can be done later. So if what you've done today is full of grammatical errors and still doesn't make sense, it doesn't matter. Just be happy with what you've got on the page. And remember that all progress is good. So if you get really stuck, use a placeholder and come back later. So if you just don't know where you're going to go with this, just, you're mid-sentence even, you can just write yourself a comment saying you need to come back with whatever it is. You often find that when you get back to something that you've put aside one day, when you look at it the next day or the next week, it suddenly becomes clear and you're able to actually write the thing that you struggled with the last week. Sometimes you might need to change the goal for the session. So instead of writing your discussion section, you might need to perhaps decide to do your conclusion or your abstract instead. Maybe a different task will be more productive. Don't criticize yourself. Even when you're finding yourself having a really difficult day, don't get into the habit of being critical about yourself, because it gets this spiral of negativity that is really hard to get out of. And it makes it even harder to come back to the writing the next time. So you kind of set yourself up to fail. And similarly, never say, I'm not a good writer. Yes, you might start out not being the best writer in the world, but telling yourself that you're not a good writer will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So tell yourself that you're a learning writer, that you're a developing writer, anything but a failure. So we don't have that word. You are just progressing. And then remember that even the smallest progress counts towards your goal. And finally, I've mentioned several times about not editing as you go along. I quite like this graphic here that shows that a writer's versus an editor's brain. And this is intended to show that when you're writing, you've got tons of things going on. You're being really creative. You're taking all kinds of ideas from your knowledge in different parts of your brain. Whereas when you're an editor, you're just trying to you keep things smooth. Yeah, it's just none of this the chaos and the creativity going on. You're just doing one task at once. So when you're writing, just allow yourself to be that creative person. Allow yourself to have all this kind of muddle and so on, and know that you will come to this editing part later. And remember, finally, that good editing services are available for when you get stuck. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you. Okay. All right, yeah, I think there's some very good tips there on how to keep the ball moving, as it were. I think avoiding procrastination is the key there, isn't it? How often, I was just thinking of that, because I've got quite a few friends who they're either currently working on their PhD or they've finished recently. I think all of them have delayed their end date for submission of their PhD. That's very normal, I guess. I don't think I've just got a bunch of friends who are a bad example.
Yes.
So what is the normal universities?
So our policy, the university that I studied at had a very strict policy, and I received funding for my PhD that ended. And the day after it ended, I had a postdoc position to take up at the university. So I didn't really have any choice. I couldn't imagine going into the postdoc position without having finished my PhD. Well, it couldn't, because I needed to be finished. Yes. So as I say, like in the end, after procrastinating for a couple of years, like in the end, like the last 6 months, I really knuckled down to it. And yeah, I say, like I just wish I'd had some more guidance earlier on to help me not get into a mess before I managed to straighten myself out again. And I think that's the reason, like if you don't have somebody really pushing you, it's very easy to let the whole process drift, and sadly some people just never find themselves finishing, which yeah is just such a terrible waste of effort and very disappointing.
Yeah, I think got a few people that are leaving now, because we've come up to the hour, but yeah, I think, I mean, that idea of the creative side of the brain, I think in my own training, I also mentioned, I think it's the right side of the brain is the creative side, is that correct? And the left side is the more organizing part. Yeah. So it's actually to free up that creative side and just get something down on paper, so that, you know, later on you can always go back to it and edit it and look. I think too many people edit as they write, and that just slows them right down, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think you get really focused on. Yeah, you're focused on looking at, like, finding the exact perfect word to go in the sentence, or agonizing over which verb tense to use and so on. But it's really hard, because it makes you you can't get anything out on the page when you're doing that. You have this kind of critical voice all the time saying, no, that's not enough.
With a sort of very negative feedback loop that then creates.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I'm just got one question here. They say they've published their study as a conference paper already, and they've extended the study and hope to publish it in a journal. Is there anything that they should be careful about when writing the journal paper, since some content may overlap?
As far as I'm aware, most journals will accept that research may have already been presented at a conference and appear in a publication as a conference paper. So we are obviously, it's obviously not possible to publish the same data twice, but in this case of a conference paper and the final journal paper, I think that's acceptable. Obviously avoiding as much overlap as possible in the actual writing, so not writing the same thing verbatim, it makes sense, but I think that as far as the actual data is concerned, it's allowable.
Right, yes. Okay, I hope that's answered your question there. Then you mentioned some apps that help to close articles, close other programs that are running. Were there any that came to mind? I
can't. Did I?
I mean, you didn't have any up there. I know. I mean,
did I not have any there?
No,
yeah.
I got some which I use on my phone, but I didn't know if there were any on the computer that would have the same effect. I guess you just have to Google them.
Yeah, no, I didn't have any on the slide. Yes, sorry, I should have put some up there, but okay. Yeah, there are lots available. I think they're not hard to find.
Okay, I have another question that's come through. From your experience, which part or section of the writing process is the most difficult in relation to a research article? The literature review, the methodology, the results discussion, or the conclusion? Just in your own personal view, thank you.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, I found writing the discussion most difficult. The method was always easy because that was decided. You know, that's just facts. You can easily get those down. Same with the results. It's just reporting your analyses, which is not that hard. The literature review, it can be really difficult because you have to keep it obviously very focused. But once you've got that right, it needs to kind of be done hand in hand with the discussion. And I always find the discussion really difficult because you don't want to be repeating stuff from earlier on in the paper, but at the same time, you have to tie it all together. So it's just having to be really careful, I think, about the relevance of everything that you put into the discussion. And also, this is your final chance to get your message across. So this is where the impact of the paper comes from, I think, is in the discussion. So if you don't convince people in the discussion that your work has been important, that it has some relevance and meaning, then you've failed, really, even if your method and results and everything are absolutely sound. So for me, that was the hardest bit, just making sure that I had got that message absolutely as tight as it could be.
I think that's something we talked about before. The audience is everything, right? If you haven't explained to them, if they can't understand what you've written, then you failed. And that's what you're saying.
Absolutely, yeah. Or somebody reads it and goes, "So what?"
So what? That's the worst. Absolutely,
yes.
That's got to be the worst.
Absolutely the worst,
right?
Yeah.
You want to have people going, "Why? What?" You know, they want those positive questions, not the "so what" one. That's just
absolutely. There's another question here. How do you deal with perfectionism in editing at the stage of proof editing? Every time I look at a published paper, I find errors in it, and a lot of these are not things that a professional editor would detect. Oh, I've begun to. Yes. Okay. So, of course, nobody wants to publish a paper with typos or errors in it. I would really recommend getting as many people to proofread it as possible. When I was producing my early papers, my mentor made me rewrite them several times over. So I'd produce what I thought was a great draft, and then he would say, rewrite it again differently. And so I would just keep rewriting, and then would do the same with the proofing. So I would give it to him to read. I would give it to as many people as possible to read, and everybody would come up with something different. And we find this even in our editing service. Like we all our papers are edited by 2 editors, and it's surprising like how many errors we still find when we're going through. An editor's been really careful, and no matter how observant you are, something gets through occasionally. So I completely sympathize with it, but I think all you can do is just keep working at it, but do it once your paper is finished, not at the time you're still constructing the paper, because at that point that effort could well be wasted. That sentence might never make it into the final cut. So don't agonize over it early on, but I say, yeah. I think
you've always got to keep in mind that deadline, haven't you? And at some point, the paper has to be submitted. And I think you've got that constant fear of, having an error in there. You're just going to have to come to terms with the fact that
there is
whatever you write, you can go back to it in 3 months' time and go, oh, if I had done this, oh.
Yeah.
So I think you've just got to realize that at that point, at that moment when I submitted it, it was the best I could do. And as you said, we're all developing writers. I think even our editors who've been with us for as long as you always find there are new tricks, new ways to improve what we write and how we edit.
Yeah. Yeah. So.
So yes, meeting deadlines. Sorry, that's it.
Yeah.
Meeting deadlines. Yes.
Yeah. Right. I think here we have another comment. Response, bright side. It's got a lot better because of my hard work. Yes. Okay. That does improve. And I think the job of proofreading your own work does get better. And as I say, but I think a lot of that you need feedback from other people. I think you need other people to point things out to you, because I think when you write something yourself, it's very easy to convince yourself that it's logical and understandable, and the story is kind of really straight in your mind because you've done all the work for it. But for somebody else, that's not necessarily the case. So I say,
sure. I mean, here we would today. Most of the audience are non-native English speakers, and I just want to reassure them that, I mean, when I submitted my thesis, I had it proofread by a friend. I don't think it's not a matter of, oh, just because you speak English, you write perfect English. That's definitely not the case. You do need that extra pair of eyes you can always find issues in other people's work.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good point, because I think people whose first language is English don't use editing services so much, but a lot of them really ought to. There are a lot of there's a lot of badly written papers. I think just because English is your language doesn't mean to say you automatically absorb the art of writing research papers and writing well. So I think we all struggle with it to a certain extent, and we need to take all the help and advice we can get.
All right. So a final thank you very much to Rachel. Enjoy the rest of your day in Italy. For us in Asia, where most of us are today, good night, sleep well, and wake up refreshed tomorrow, so you've got a nice clear head to commence your writing. And we look forward to catching you at the next webinar, which will be coming up in a not too distant future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks.